Okay, good evening, everybody. One or two people are still grabbing seats. We know how to bring in the saddest days of the year here at Park East with a barbecue. And now we're going to add some Torah to it. I actually want to begin the evening. It's fantastic to be here at Park East. It's lovely to see. Thank you. It's lovely to see so many people. My wife and I are so thrilled to be here and to see so many friends, familiar faces, some new faces, and those online. I just want to begin actually by highlighting those who, in their generosity, have sponsored tonight's lecture, shiur, to add to the Torah and content of this community. Edward Lipke and wife, Alana Ayam Zalag, everybody, it's with their spouse and the couple, the entire family. So Edward Lipke, Alana Ayam Zalag, Mark Seidelman, Cynthia Pearl, and Alan Burke. Thank you so much. So I said that we're wrapping up the 3 weeks, part of the 3 weeks, and getting to the 9 days, part of the 3 weeks, and that's on our mind, and that always brings Israel on our mind. And we read the news, and Israel's on our mind, because President Herzog just landed, and now we know that Prime Minister Netanyahu is also going to head here, and we realize how all of that's very loaded, and we're following carefully and closely because it matters to us, and it's the 75th anniversary of Israel, of course. So it's a special year in general for us, celebrating along with Israel. So I want to begin with a famous name in Israeli history, Yitzhak Rabin, the late prime minister, who earlier in his career, of course, had a storied military career. Everybody has a handout. It's crucial to have a handout. And on page 1, source 1, Rabin was honored with an honorary doctorate from the Hebrew University in June 1967. Obviously, things quieted down by then because he was pretty busy in the first part of June. But at the end of the month, Hebrew University got right in there and honored him with a doctorate. And here you see a little bit in small a photo of Rabin in military attire, the official recording, I think, and advertisement. And he gave a moving speech that night or that day when he got the degree. And I encourage everybody to look it up. You could find it online in full translation. But I'll just read a little bit together. What have soldiers to do with the academic world, which stands for the life of civilization and culture? What have those who are professionally occupied with violence to do with spiritual values? Which already marks the person. He's uncomfortable getting an honorary doctorate. He's a chief of staff. He's a warrior. What's he doing at the university? Third line, the answer, I think, is that in this honor which you have conferred through me upon my fellow soldiers, so first modest note, he says it's not for me, of course, it's for the soldiers. You chose to express your appreciation of the special character of the IDF, which is itself an expression of the distinctiveness of the Jewish people as a whole. So the IDF, an army, actually expresses Jewish values. And then I skip to the part that's most relevant for us tonight. In every sector, our commanders of all ranks prove themselves superior to those of the enemy. So he talks about the soldiers, and then he gets to the commanders. And he brags about IDF commanders. I continue. Their resourcefulness, their intelligence, their power of improvisation, their concern for their troops, and here's the key for us tonight, and above all, their practice in leading their men into battle. Uvikar Halalicha kadima lifnei pkudehem. That the commanders lead by example. They lead at the front of the troops. They fight in the front line at the front of their troops. And then he continues, these, what I just read and some other things, are not matters of technique or equipment, right? This is not military strategy, or not just military strategy. There is no intelligible explanation for all our achievements, he means, except one: their profound conviction that the war they were fighting was a just one. You hear the cheshbon hanefesh, not bragging in triumph, but saying and affirming the justness of the Six-Day War. All these things have their origin in the Spirit and end in the Spirit. A very powerful line for a military man. The origin and the end of IDF advantages and IDF commander advantages are in the Spirit. Our soldiers prevailed not by the strength of their weapons, but by their sense of mission, by their consciousness of the justice of their cause, by deep love of their country, and by their understanding of the heavy task laid upon them to ensure the existence of our people in their homeland and to affirm, even at the cost of their lives, the right of the Jewish people to live its life in its own state, free, independent, and in peace. Of course, there's something even more moving reading these words now, because we know how sincerely Yitzhak Rabin lived these words and paid with the cost of his life for these words. The idea, which I want to focus on tonight, is the italicized line in that second paragraph about the commander's practice of leading their men into battle, leading, being at the front. The commander leads by example even on the battlefield. This has a one-word name today in Israeli society. I'm sure there's some people in the room here, and certainly watching, who maybe know it. The word is acharai. It's a one-word mantra. Acharai, follow me. And it's expected of all ktsinim, all officers in the IDF to this day, to inculcate and live up to that mantra, acharai. What I expect the commanders tells the troops of you is what I will model myself. Follow me. Follow the example I embody. This is a mantra to this day in the year 2023, but it has roots in earlier, actually even pre-state Israeli history. It has roots in the Palmach, pre-1948. You could find it articulated in a letter of Ben Gurion, which I did not bring here, but I've seen with my own eyes. I double-checked. And this really took off in the 1950s through the examples of people like Dayan, legends, and Arik Sharon. Let's read source 2 on the bottom. This is from a work that was written about the Tzanchanim, the paratroopers, in the 1950s, the first decade of the State of Israel. And here we read on the bottom, the IDF paratroopers, through the initiative of Moshe Dayan and Arik Sharon, attached a halo to this concept, the concept of acharai, follow me, transforming it into an essential concept in the education of officers to proper leadership. And they infused the phrase acharai, follow me, with new meaning. So this became, in the 1950s, especially in the paratroopers, and from there it spread to all the battalions and all the different divisions of the IDF, until in 1967, Rabin highlights it, and ever since, it's become commonplace. in Israeli society and especially in the IDF. Rabin, I think, knew all this history. The Palmach, Ben Gurion, Dayan, Arik Sharon. No doubt he was forged through the lore of these lions. But maybe he didn't know an earlier source that advances, I would submit, the same exact principle. Turn the page. Please. Page 2, source 3. On a verse in the Torah, there's a comment of Rashi. First, we'll begin in the verse that we read recently in synagogue, in Parshat Pinchas. The verse is the scene where Moshe turns to God and says, I need somebody to take over when I'm no longer here. Yifkod Hashem Elokei haruchot l'chol basar ish al ha'ida asher yitzeh lifnehem v'asher yavo lifnehem. Let the Lord, the God of spirits of all flesh, appoint a man over the congregation who will go forth before them and come before them. Commenting on that phrase, Yetzeh lifnehem and Yavo lifnehem, a leader to lead in the front. Rashi cites a midrash. I'll read it in English. Who will go forth before them, not like the kings of the Gentile nations who sit at home and send their armies to war, but as I did. Moshe says, for I fought against Sichon and Og. When the Israelites fought against the Amorites and the other nations that they fought in the desert, Moshe led by example. And he tells God that the next leader also has to lead by example, not figuratively, literally on the battlefield, to be there, to be on the front, to lead by example. And the midrash that Rashi cites comments, not as other nations do. Not as other nations do, that the leader is safely ensconced in their palace, in their home, and they have the soldiers doing the dirty work. What I want to do right now is try to unpack this midrash that Rashi cites. It actually comes in two variants, and I want to contextualize it. It's always, I guess, stirring to say, we do it this way, others do it the other way. Others send their troops to do the dirty work, and they're in their palace. So I want to begin with that. Who are these others? And is the midrash accurate? Or is the midrash just picking on a straw man, a straw leader? Well, if I had to conjecture, Rashi, the medievalist, is citing a midrash, which is a 2nd century CE rabbinic work. And the rabbis in the 2nd century CE are living in Judea, Palestine, modern-day Israel. And the others that they know most intimately are the Romans. So this seems to be a shtuch, as they say in Yiddish, against the Romans. And my question is this fair? Is there any truth to this about the Romans? So the midrash in the form that we just read it is source number 4. We won't read it inside right now. We'll return to that in a bit. And it talks about the other kings being in their palace. So is that true about the Roman emperors? So I want to now turn, now we have to skip to a later page, page 4. Source number 9. This is a Latin text, but thankfully for everybody here, I could not do this in the original, so here we have the English. And it's a panegyric. That's a fancy word. Panegyric is a formal praise, giving formal honor. There's an orator that gives formal honor. Now, I have to say, here at Park East Synagogue, we know how to do pomp and circumstance, but we have yet to have a Latin panegyric. So maybe one day. So here, let's read the Latin panegyric that was recited to Emperor Constantine, otherwise known as Constantinus I or Constantine the Great. Ends up being a legendary emperor in the West because he's the emperor under which the Roman Empire converted to Christianity. But that's not our issue here. Let's read it together, the praise given to Constantine. How pampered by good luck in administering the state and obtaining praise were those emperors who, while spending their days at Rome, had triumphs and victory titles of nations conquered by their generals accrued to them. Exactly the point of the Midrash. The orator says, look at these early emperors sitting, living the good life in Rome, while their soldiers did the hard work on the battlefield, and they took credit. Third line, thus when Flatto was praising the emperor Antoninus, and it's in the middle of the 2nd century CE, in the heart of rabbinic Judaism, 2nd century CE, for having brought the war in Britain to completion, meaning if you go back 140 years or so, there was another panegyric orator who gave praise to an earlier emperor, and he said, great victory, Antoninus, that you had in Britain, although he remained behind in the city of Rome, in the palace itself, and had delegated command of the war to others. He averred that the emperor deserved the glory of the whole launching and course, as if he had actually presided at the helm of worship. So this is a really good way to flatter Constantine, saying in the past, emperors earned cheap praise for victory. They sat in Rome, they took all the credit, but they did none of the hard work. Last 4 lines, but you, invincible Caesar, meaning Emperor Constantine, were the commander-in-chief of that whole expedition of yours, both of the actual sailing and the fighting itself, not only by right of your imperial authority, but by your personal participation and by the example of your firm resolve were its instigator and driving force. So come the early 300s, which is later than the Midrash, there's a shift. Constantine gets in deep in the trenches, right? He gets his hands dirty, bloody even in warfare. But earlier emperors apparently at times sat in Rome. Now, I have to say, there's a topic I got interested in, and I've had a back and forth with classicists who know more than me about this stuff. And they say this is not all literally true. There are some emperors who got somewhat involved, etc. But as a generalization, I think it is true that emperors, even if they had some degree of involvement, it was usually at a certain level of remove. And certainly some of the most famous ones sat in Rome during some of the most important battles. And if you think of the rabbis, and we'll talk about this more in the continuation, I think the rabbis know the wars that transpired this time of year that we're commemorating in the 1st century CE against Rome, the Great Revolt around 70 CE, 66 to 70 CE, and the Bar Kokhba Revolt, 132 to 135 CE. And they notice that the emperor is absent. Now, it's a little tricky, and I'll have more to say about that. But overall, this generalization seems to be true for certain emperors, seems to be enough of a stereotype that even in the Roman world they have it. And I think the rabbis also picked up on it, that with all these Roman forces battling in Judea and Galilee and in other places, the emperor is basically nowhere to be found. He's back in Rome. Now, matters get more interesting. I think we have to peek back at page 2 for a second. I'm sorry, we're going to have to jump back to page 2 for a minute, and then we'll turn back to page 4 or 5. Back on page 2, I said that this midrash of the way Jews fight versus the way others, which I'm saying Romans fight, actually appears in 2 different versions. The version we were just alluding to is, I'm sorry, before I said the wrong number, it's page 2, source 5. That's the one that Rashi was referring to. Page 2, source 5. It talks about the kings dwelling in their houses or palaces. You see that on the bottom of page 2, source 5. That's what we just referred to. But there's another version quoted in source 4, page 2. Let's just read it in the English. Sifrei Bamidbar, who shall go out before them in battle and come in before them in battle, not in the manner that others act who send their troops ahead and they come in the rear, or they come after all this battle is over, but rather as Moses did, as Joshua did, as Phinehas did, as Yoav did. Now, if you look at the names I just recited, I'm sorry I said them fast, they're not all kings or leaders or rulers. Maybe Moshe is, maybe Joshua is, but Pinchas is not. Yoav is not. And it's pretty clear that in this version of the Midrash, the idea is not where is the king or the ruler, but rather where is the general or the commander? Where is the head of the army? Is the head of the army up front? Is the commander or the officer up front? And of course, maybe we'll make distinctions between generals and officers and different ranks. But let's just generalize. Where's the general or commander? Do they lead up front by example? Or are they at the rear? Are they observing? Are they taking in an overview? Are they making plans? But they're not actually fighting by example up front. And the Midrash in source 4 says, we Jews fight one way, our commanders, our generals are up front. But other nations, which now I'm going to plug in Romans, fight where their commander or general is not up front, but rather in the rear or supervising from behind. Is that true? Let's turn now again to, actually this time page 5. Page 5, source number 10. This is a work, you see the visual over there, of Ona Sander, okay? And it is called Strategikos. I'm messing up the Greek, okay? Now, I brought you on top here, and on top we have a 16th century translation into Latin. The reason this work is written in Greek, it's a 1st century Roman work written in Greek by Ona Sander. And that term, strategikos, is the general. It's a Greek term for the general. The reason I brought it in Latin is if I felt like, I know there's one, I'm not going to out them over here, there's one person at least here who knows how to read Greek. And I'm not talking about myself. I have some minimal knowledge, but there is somebody here, so you could take your guesses at the end. But here I brought it just in Latin so we could follow along. Just you see that nice picture. And you see that's the portrait on the left side of the picture, a general. And this is actually an amazing work, okay, because it survived. And it's a 2,000-year-old Roman manual in Greek for generals. And it gives instruction to generals how to be a model general and what is the right way to lead an army man. And this actually has an interesting afterlife. For about 600-700 years, it was used and recovered and actually influenced some later emperors in the 7th and 8th century CE. I think Byzantine emperors, I would assume because of the Greek, and then eventually gets translated into Latin, and then eventually we get it here in English. Now, if you look in source 10, I brought a whole paragraph. I won't read the whole paragraph, but this is paragraph 33 of Ona Sander's work for the general. And what's principle 33 for the general? That the general should not himself enter battle. Exactly what the rabbis in the Sifrei describe. It's literally a rule for generals according to this manual. I'll read a little bit. The general should fight cautiously rather than boldly, or should keep away altogether from a hand-to-hand fight with the enemy. For even if in battle he shows that he is not to be outdone in valor, he can aid his army far less by fighting than he can harm it if he should be killed, since the knowledge of a general is far more important than his physical strength. And I have to say, it goes on to give some pretty good reasons why it makes sense that the general should not lead up front, but rather should restrain. We could imagine an army man is maybe, this doesn't speak to me, but chomping at the bit to try to get out there, to try to lead, to try to show his slacker soldiers how to do things. No, restrain yourself. You're the general. Do not go out into battle. You stay behind. And he gives the example in the next paragraph here in source 10, like imagine a ship captain. Ship captain can't do what the sailors are supposed to do. Ship captain is the captain. I was about to say he, I apologize, he, but I think it's true to the world I'm describing. Okay, so the ship captain cannot do what sailors do. They have to be the captain, so too the general has to be the general, and onward. Now, you might argue that that's fine and nice for a manual. But just because it's in a manual doesn't mean that, in fact, this is the way warfare happened. Maybe, in fact, generals ignored Ona Sander's ultimate guide, right? The Dale Carnegie guide to public being a general. No, they did whatever they wanted to do. So it's hard to know, and we would have to really try to reconstruct what we could about generals, but I bring one piece of corroborating evidence, although also stylized, and that's on the bottom of page 5. The great Roman historian Tacitus, bottom of page 5, same page, source 11, Tacitus describes a battle that took place in the year 69 CE. Now, I have to say, for us, of course, this is so interesting because all we think about is Romans being in Judea in 69 CE. But Romans were all over the place in 69 CE. And the very same Vespasian, who we know was involved in Judean affairs around this time, also was involved in other battles. And here we have the battle in Cremona in 69 CE. Those who are really in deep in Roman history know that this is a tumultuous year in Roman history. It's known as the year of the 4 emperors because following Nero's suicide in 68, there was a major up for grabs, all out battle royale for who's going to be the next emperor. And eventually Vespasian, through the battlefield, appropriates the imperial role. And it's a shift to a new dynasty, Vespasian and then Titus and all the evil figures that we know from Jewish history. They're actually the next line of the Flavian emperors. So here on the bottom, that was just a word of background, but Tacitus, the Roman historian, describes the way Vespasian's soldiers, not Vespasian himself, but the way his commander dealt with the army. And he said the following: there is a division of duties between the army and its generals. Eagerness for battle becomes the soldiers, but generals serve the cause by forethought, by counsel, by delay oftener than by temerity. As I promoted your victory to the utmost of my power by my sword and by my personal exertions when I was a soldier, you have to add, of course, so now I must help you by prudence, counsel, the qualities which belong peculiarly to a general. And it's quite clear he's also saying, I'm going to be at a distance, and I'm going to rein you in, and I'm going to restrain you. I am going to be, I'll add, the quintessential Onasanderian general. That's what the general of Vespasian's forces said at the Battle of Cremona in Italy, which they proceeded to win. So, I'm going to pause over here. We began with Rabin, and Rabin said that a modern ethos of the IDF is that the commander leads up front by example. And then we saw a Rashi cite a Midrash. And Rashi in the Midrash says, Jewish rulers lead by example. They don't hide in the palace. And then in another version, Jewish commanders are up front among the ranks of the troops. They do not guard the rear. And I just interrogated this midrash to say, I'm all into the us versus them, but is this just rabbinic fantasy or is there truth to it? I think quite remarkably, we see substantiation for both versions of the midrash about the them, meaning the Romans. In one version, a critique of the Roman emperors who dwelled in Rome in their palace while their troops did battle. And in another version, a deliberate, strategic, or I think strategic policy in a manual that says, commander or general, you do not lead in battle. You actually better not to enter into battle at all. And an example of the Battle of Cremona in 69 CE, which apparently that's exactly what happened, that the general showed restraint and distinguished his role from that of the soldiers. Now, what did rabbis, or Jews, let me say, and then rabbis, did they know this? Well, apparently they did from the Midrash, but how did they observe this? And then what did they think about it? I turn now to page 6. If you see in page 6, everybody's with me, page 6, source number 12. Here we have a few excerpts from the great Jewish historian of antiquity, Josephus. Josephus is such an important resource for Jewish history because without him we would be totally in the dark until about the 16th century. Or maybe a little bit in medieval times. I see my sister, Professor Sharon Flatto, in the room, so she's going to correct me. But he's the great Jewish historian of antiquity. And he actually is, in a way, most reliable, in a way, about events in his own lifetime. Josephus lived in the 1st century CE, and he lived through the revolt against Rome. He actually was a general in the Galilee in the revolt against Rome, where he then surrendered very controversially and lived out his life as a very dignified prisoner of war in very good circumstances in Rome. And he used his time well as a dignified prisoner of war, writing Jewish history, sitting in Rome, but very proud of the Jewish story. And he writes a few works of Jewish history. Most relevant for us tonight is his first work, The Judean War. He writes a 7-volume account of the very war that he lived through. And to a certain degree, it's invaluable. It's eyewitness. He also has a perspective and an agenda. We'll put that on the side for now. He has a very interesting excursus in Judean War, Volume 3, for some 40 paragraphs. Let's just read a little bit. Source 12 on page 6, 12a on the top. Now here one cannot but admire at the precaution of the Romans. So he writes nice things about the Romans, actually a lot of nice things. And we'll see what he focuses on. Indeed, if anyone does but attend to the other parts of their military discipline. Okay, now this is interesting. A Jew who surrendered, he saw what the Romans did to devastate Judea, destroyed the temple. He's sitting in Rome. And here you know why he's a controversial figure, because of paragraphs like this. He's flattering the Romans. Now maybe you'll say his hands are tied. He's trying to get along with all the Flavian emperors who are hosting him. But my sense is some of this is authentic. He admires them. He admires their military and their order and their discipline. He will be forced to confess that their obtaining so large a dominion hath been the acquisition of their valor and not the bare gift of fortune. So he says they are courageous. And then for 40 paragraphs he describes the discipline and the preparedness of the military, of the Roman military, which some have compared to an earlier thinker, Polybius. I'll leave that. And then we see towards the very end of 12a, this is after the 40 paragraphs, this account I have given the reader, not so much with the intention of commending the Romans, now he's getting apologetic, because it's a big question, who is his audience? But presumably he thinks some Jews My guess is he wanted everybody to read his work, like any proud author. So he also thought Jews might read it. So he gets uncomfortable. So it's not about that. As of comforting those that have been conquered by them. Don't feel bad if they crushed you. They're the, colossal force. They're the 800-pound gorilla. And for deterring others for attempting innovations under their government. Don't start up with them. Words for the wise. Now that's Josephus. And Josephus admires them. And he notices things about them, and he pays attention to them, and he could describe them at length. The first century CE army. But he has another paragraph that I think demonstrates that it wasn't just Josephus who was looking closely at Roman soldiers. And here is a painful paragraph for us to read, especially this time of year, because here in 12b, he's describing none other than the steps that led to Churban Beit HaMikdash, Beit Sheni, destruction of the Second Temple. And the campaign of Titus, who was then the general, Titus, the son of Vespasian, who was promoted to emperor, we just described earlier in 69. So Titus takes over, and he's the general. And Titus, we know, Titus Harasha, according to the rabbis, in his cruelty. And Josephus describes some of his methodic game plan. I'll just read a little bit and then skip to the underlines. A resolution was now taken by Titus to relax the siege for a little while, to see whether the demolishing of their second wall would not make them a little more compliant. So he paused in his campaign of terror, but it's also psychological, his campaign, saying rather than fighting all out the next step, maybe now they'll finally surrender, these recalcitrant and stubborn and, reckless from his mind, but fearless Jewish rebels who are trapped in the temple area in Jerusalem in the old city. So he says, I've shown them our might, maybe they'll surrender. But now, in the strategy, third line, he gave orders that the commanders should put the army into battle array. So rather than a timeout to just hang around the shuk in the old city, he tells his officers, you get your Roman soldiers in full battle gear, in full display of their might, of their weaponry, and let them intimidate the heck out of everybody in Jerusalem. And he describes that indeed they did this, about 2 lines above the underline. Then did the places that were before the city shine very splendidly. Splendid meaning because they're in their armor. And it was quite a sight, a spectacle. Nor was there anything so grateful to Titus's own men or so terrible to the enemy. So the soldiers, the Roman soldiers, were all proud for all their regalia and all their armor, and the enemies were, meaning the Jews, were terrified. And look at the underline. For the whole old wall and the north side of the temple were full of spectators. And one might see the houses full of such as looked at them. Nor was there any part of the city which was not covered over with their multitudes. So Josephus gives a pretty terrible, harrowing scene that the Jewish rebels packed into the old city are all gazing, and there's no room left to be a spectator, to look at this terrible sight, to see up front the Roman soldiers in all their force. And I want to suggest that maybe this is an extreme moment, but I think it captures what no doubt must have been true, that the Judeans who saw Roman forces throughout the 1st and 2nd century CE, but especially up to 4 legions at certain times, maybe even up to 6 legions. We're talking about tens of thousands of soldiers, and they stared at them, and they looked at them, and they noticed them. And I would submit they also noticed things about their discipline. And maybe they even noticed things about where is their commander. Not just where's their emperor, but where's their commander and where's their general. And they took it in. And I think proof of that is the rabbis in this midrash, where the rabbis in the midrash say, us Jews are different than them. They fight that their emperor is in Rome. They fight in a way that their commander or general supervises from the rear. Not just Josephus took it in, but the masses took it in, and apparently some rabbis also took it in and noticed it. So this brings us to the next part of what I want to analyze. Let me just sum up where we are. We began with Rabbin, and then we went back to a midrash, and the midrash is us versus them, and the them are the Romans, the emperor is in Rome, or the general is in the rear. And then we pointed out that not just Josephus, but many Jews apparently stared and took things in and noticed. Josephus, no doubt, in more detail than others. He himself was a general. He's a historian. But apparently the masses, at least at certain points, noticed this, and so did rabbis. So what was the reaction of rabbis to Roman discipline and praxis, and even this ethos of where should the king be, where should the general be? Before we get to the midrashim that Rashi cited, I want to point out a midrash where maybe the rabbis are not so different than Josephus. Maybe in one midrash, the rabbis think of the Romans as the paradigm of a well-ordered and disciplined army, and you want to know how to fight? Follow the Romans. They know what they're doing. We know Gemara. They know how to fight. There's a midrash, I think, that might have this sense. Look on page, we have to skip back now, page 3, source 6. Page 3, source 6. We're in a midrash, an early midrash. The midrash does not speak about Romans. The midrash speaks about the Bible and the Torah, about figures we already heard tonight, Moshe and Yoshua and Pinchas and Yoav. And the midrash also speaks about other figures in the Torah, including none other than Pharaoh. And there are a bunch of midrashim on Paro, on Pharaoh, that are extremely interesting. And some of them, you feel that Pharaoh is being compared and contrasted beneath the surface, between the lines, to Romans, although they never say Romans. So let's read a little bit of this midrash. Now we have to set the scene. The scene is Pharaoh with his chariots. When is Pharaoh with his chariots? Heading towards the Red Sea. Now, this is not Pharaoh's finest hour, right? This is a difficult hour for Pharaoh, because when Pharaoh is heading towards the Red Sea, this is Pharaoh in all his desperation, right? Pharaoh tried to hold on to the Israelites. Pharaoh enslaved them for, centuries, then resisted over the course of 10 plagues. And eventually, after the 10th plague, the Israelites escape, and Pharaoh does not know when to give in. And Pharaoh almost feverishly chases after the Israelites, right? We all remember the scene. And the Midrash, at least in some places like here, pours it on. And you feel for the Midrash. Because the Midrash is not just piling on Pharaoh. The Midrash is piling on all the arch enemies, all the generals and rulers, all those who were brutal against the Israelites. So the Midrash, in almost cartoonish fashion, tries to capture this. Page 3, source 6. And Pharaoh took his people with him. Let's read a bit in the English. Page 3, source 6. Pharaoh enlisted them with his words, meaning no Egyptians wanted to fight with Pharaoh. They had it. Let those Israelite slaves, ex-slaves, let them do what they need to do. Let them escape. We're not with you, Pharaoh. We're not fighting with you. And Pharaoh, desperate, had to try to cajole them and convince them and bribe the Egyptians to join him. He enlisted them with words. He said to them, "It is the custom of kings to direct from the rear while their armies advance before them, but I will lead in front." In other words, Pharaoh looks at his Egyptian troops and sees they don't want to fight. And he says, okay, I'm leading, you follow me. And then he cuts other deals with them. He tells them, you know what, the plunder we'll get from the Israelites, I'm supposed to get first dibs. But you know what, we'll all share equal. And then he says, and even more than that, I'll take all my silver and all my gold and all my stones and all my pearl, and I'll distribute to you. Now, I think it's very clear that this Midrash is mocking Pharaoh. As I said, it's piling on. It's showing a ruthless leader who has lost his marbles and so consumed by hatred of Israelites that he cannot stop. And in his desperation, he's willing to do anything, and he loses all sense of protocol, all sense of order, all sense of discipline. In a word, in this Midrash, Pharaoh has lost it in being so anti-Roman in his demeanor. I don't mean against the Romans, but so non-Roman. Pharaoh should be the consummate emperor who's fighting, staying back in Egypt, staying in his palace, or being the general, supervising from the rear. That's the right way to fight. But in his desperation, this cartoon mockery of Pharaoh who's lost it in his despair, he's willing to do anything, even to fight up front. So that's an interesting rabbinic midrash, which to my mind reminds me of Josephus. Between the surfaces, the rabbis aren't going to come out and give compliments to Romans. They just can't swallow that. That's going to be extremely rare. You could find a few rare lines like that in rabbinic literature. But between the lines, I think they're saying model armies fight like the way the Romans fight, where the king or ruler stays behind, or at least supervises, does not lead up front. And yet, what I find more intriguing are the midrashim we saw on page 2. I'll just remind you, the midrashim we saw on page 2. What's the heart of those midrashim? They fight their way, we fight our way. Nations fight with their kings in their palace. Our rulers are on the battlefield. Nations fight where their generals supervise from the rear. Our generals or commanders lead by example, acharai. That is a very proud rabbinic voice. It's a very proud rabbinic voice, especially, of course, given that they lost. They lost to the Romans. They lost a few times to the Romans. They got crushed by the Romans. And yet the rabbis in the Midrash say they fight their way, we fight our way. Now, I want to try to contextualize this a bit, and then to think about the ideas. And here I think we have remarkable possible context again. On page 6, we got to go forward to page 6. Sorry, there's some back and forth here. Page 6, 12c, you don't want to miss this. Again, Josephus describing, but giving us an intimate battle scene from the final fight over the temple area involving Titus, who is the general. And Josephus gives us the following description. You could see here below I have a painting, just for a bit of show and tell. It's a much more modern painting, and it's a pretty gruesome, terrible painting for us Jews to look at, because this is the Temple Mount in the Italian imagination of the 19th century, and it's the Antonia Fortress, which is the fortress right near the Beit HaMikdash, where there was a major final battle, right? We're reading here 12c. This is further on in Josephus's account, where the rebels did not, despite the spectacle of Titus's soldiers, they did not cave, they did not surrender, and they fought down to the very last troops, and of course, the results were devastating, and the Antonia fortress was destroyed, and the temple was razed and destroyed. And Josephus describes something about this moment, the battle over the Antonia, the fortress of the temple, 12c. But as he was now in his armor, page 6, last source, he is Titus, general of the Romans, and preparing to go down with them, his friends would not let him go. What did Titus want to do? He wanted to be in the heart of the battle. He wanted to be in the Antonia, fighting against the Judean rebels. And he was restrained by reason of the greatness of the danger and what the commanders suggested to them. For they said, there's the underline, that he would do more by sitting above in the tower of Antonia as a dispenser of rewards to those soldiers that signalized themselves in the fight than by coming down and hazarding his own person in the forefront of them. Stay at a remove, Titus. That's the advice, for that they would all fight stoutly while Caesar, meaning Titus, who's not yet Caesar, he will become Caesar, looked upon them. With this advice, Caesar, meaning Titus, complied, and said that the only reason he had for such compliance with the soldiers was this, that he might be able to judge of their courageousness. According to Josephus, he's somewhat uneasy, he's somewhat apologetic. He realizes there's something lame about what he's doing. There's something craven and cowardly about what he's doing. So he justifies it. Last lines. So he sent the soldiers about their work at the hour aforementioned, while he went out himself to a higher place to observe. And I would say, one could imagine Jews who noticed this, the rebels who noticed this, the leaders of the rebels who were in the heart of the battle, and they notice, or they hear rumor, or they hear word that General Titus is nowhere to be found. He is observing at a safe distance. And perhaps, of course I'm conjecturing here, they pass this on. And this is part of the way they tell the story. The story, true, of course, the results are clear, but let's not forget what we're about and what they're about. And one of the things we're about is our commanders and generals are right there on the front lines as opposed to them, as opposed to Titus. Now, I'll just briefly throw out another speculation, and this is for sure conjecture, but I think it is tempting conjecture. On page 7, a little show and tell also, that on page 7, we have on the bottom a remarkable material artifact that can be viewed, I believe, in the Israel Museum. Has anybody seen this? You saw it when it was here. Okay. So this is a reconstructed and pieced together statue of Emperor Hadrian. On the bottom left, a remarkable statue with a torso. If you look up front in the torso, there's 6 naked warriors. All of this is grounds for endless scholarly articles. What does that mean? And what does that symbolize? And where did that come from? But overall, I think it's clear that it signifies Emperor Hadrian figure, impressive figure in the land of Israel. The statue was planted in the land of Israel in Tel Shalem. That's the name of the place. I believe it's not far from Beit Shan. And showing a huge, larger-than-life statue of Hadrian warrior, Emperor warrior Hadrian. By the way, footnote, how was this discovered? In the year 1975, some American was visiting, I think, a sister in a kibbutz near Tel Shalem, and started to just walk out with some like metal detector, just curious, reading that there are all sorts of old coins in Israel. And sure enough, he came upon the beginnings of this, and then the antiquities authorities quickly removed him and said, we take over. And that's how they found this amazing statue of Hadrian. I say amazing, but Hadrian embodies, like Titus, the worst enemies of the Jewish people in our lore and history. Of course, in Roman history, these are described as the good emperors, but we don't mince our words. These are the evil emperors. Now, here's the speculation I want to throw out. The head of the Romans is the Emperor Hadrian during the Bar Kokhba revolt, 132 through 135 CE. And the head of the Jewish forces is Bar Kokhba. Bar Kokhba actually takes, and this is what you see on the right side, or is given or is conferred or assumes the title of Nasi. Nasi, like Herzog, the Nasi. Nasi means the ruler, the king of the Jews. There is a king or emperor of the Romans, and there is a king for a few years of the Jews, and they are locked in another fierce battle. Surprising, amazing courage, no doubt, of Bar Kokhba and his troops to again take on the Romans after what happened in 70 CE. Now, Hadrian proclaims this as his victory. And one of the signs of that is this magnificent statue planted right there in Israel in Tel Shalem, right near the Jewish troops. But that is an impressive metal statue. And where is Hadrian? He's in all sorts of places, but there's one place he is never.
between 132 and 135 CE. He is never in Judea or any other of the battlegrounds. While Bar Kokhba, no doubt, is front and center in the battle. So when the rabbis talk about us versus them, this is not just words. In Antonia, Titus is remote and observing, and rebel leaders are deep in battle. And in the last major battle, in 132 through 135, Hadrian acts like he's on the ground, symbolizes, memorializes himself as if he's on the ground. But the Jews know the truth, and they know that the story is other. That perhaps is part of the history, but maybe more important than the history is the rabbinic legend on page 2, which takes this as a mantra and coins this as a principle of us and them. The way they fight versus the way we fight. And again, I find this so moving, given that the words of the Midrash on page 2 are recorded and transmitted after 70 CE and after 135 CE and after they know all the devastating consequences of these revolts. And yet their bottom line is, how do we fight, not how they fight. Romans do what Romans do, and we fight in a different way. Now, why is this so important? Here we could conjecture, but I think it's quite clear that some of the way we fight, we Jews, that our rulers are on the battleground, that our generals and commanders rule by example, are matters not just of military strategy, but matters of the spirit. I'm quoting Yitzhak Rabin, matters of the spirit. The spirit being bravery, courage, sacrifice, a sense of equal stakes and all in, because we're fighting over nothing less than Jewish continuity, Jewish destiny, Jewish values, and what kind of leader would not be at the forefront? And what kind of general and commander would not be at the forefront if they really took in what's at stake? In conclusion, I want to turn back to Rabin and the rabbis, which I just began to do. Let's turn back to Rabin, Yitzhak Rabin of blessed memory. In 1967, talking about how do IDF commanders fight, uvikar halicha kadima lifnei pkudeham, most important, to go up front, in front of their charges, their subordinate soldiers. Lead by example, acharai. And to me, almost prophetically, Rabin characters this as a military man, as matters of the spirit. Not thinking about the strategy behind it, not thinking about the victory behind it, thinking about the values, thinking about the spirit. And look at his own words, their origin in the spirit. I doubt Yitzhak Rabin knew it when he said it, but indeed, their origin in the spirit of the Jews, not just back to the 50s or the 40s of the 20th century, but in the spirit as recorded for perpetuity in the rabbis, in the Midrash, and then in the medieval times, repeated by Rashi, origins in the spirit, in the Jewish spirit, for 2 millennia. This is how we fight, because this reflects our commitment, our all in, our willing to sacrifice, because everything is at stake. Of course, one, in conclusion, also has to take in how opposite the context of when the rabbis are repeating this mantra and when Yitzhak Rabin is reciting these words in 67. The rabbis, crushed by the defeat against the Romans, not just in 70, but again in 132 through 135, underscore and emphasize, even if we lose, even if we are crushed, we will not forsake our commitment. We will not sell short what we stand for. What we will remember is not so much the loss, but what we were willing to commit in the fight and how we were willing to put it all on the line, whatever the consequences. And they were licking the wounds of the worst forms of consequences. And how moving that almost 2,000 years later, standing in Jerusalem at its highest point, Mount Scopus, a triumphant chief of staff of the IDF can repeat the same mantra, origins of in the spirit and in the spirit, that if we lost with that mantra, we also ultimately are led to miraculous triumph through that same mantra, through that same commitment of all in, because everything's at stake and we cannot relent, because this is our only path to ensuring Jewish destiny. We know this time of year we contrast Churban and Geulah, destruction and redemption, and the rabbis in their deep wisdom say that those who mourn over destruction will one day be exultant in triumph and redemption. And we see that manifest right here before our own eyes. If that doesn't inspire, I'm not sure what does. Next month, we will meet again and have another lecture on a very different topic, but you're all invited back. Okay, let me just take quickly 3 questions. Maybe I'll listen to all of them and briefly comment, because I don't want to hold people too long. And then anybody wants to come up afterwards, please, let's just go back in order. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for this brilliant and inspiring talk. Just a note, it seems that the contrast of Paro actually is in the front, but he has to buy off his troops. I think that was what Rabbi Dr. Flatto is stressing. He wasn't, yes, he was in the front leading his troops, but that was a false type of being in the front, because it's only because Lakach is Amo, he had to pay them off.
Nice. The comment that's made is that even in the Midrash, which shows Pharaoh up front, that's not an ethos, it's not a value, it's desperation. I think it's a very good comment. Thank you. Yeah, please.
So based on what you're saying, are you suggesting that, say, Netanyahu or the President of the United States be out in the battlefield?
That's a good question. The question is, do I want to put, well, I might have certain leaders I want to put out in battlefield, depending on their policies, but that's not really up to me. Now, it's a great question, and that's actually a certain nuance that I presented here because there are two versions. One is where's the ruler, and the other is where is the general or the commander. I think even the rabbis in their statement about the ruler, I think they're more the key point is if the ruler is somehow safely refuged in their palace, there's something wrong about that. So I don't know if that means literally that the ruler or the king or the president or the prime minister needs to literally be on the battlefield, as opposed to, I think, the IDF, comment of that, listen, people have, I've discussed some of this and everybody made your great point, okay, were Dayan, Rabin, Sharon, were they really up front? So I think it's understood some of the wisdom of Onesander that, there has to be, of course, some strategic maneuvering, but the ethos and even the praxis of certain levels of commanders are that they should really be up front. But point well taken. Yes.
Two questions. Were there any contemporaries of Josephus who contested what he wrote?
We have Roman historians, but not direct accounts, maybe some passing stuff about the wars, but the detailed 7-volume account of the rebellion of 66 through 70 C and the battles are Josephus. That's what we have, yeah.
The other thing is the very first sentence that you read, Asher Yatsa Lifnehem, Asher Yovo Lifnehem.
Yeah.
I read that as, yes, you will be a leader and lead them, but where it says Yovo Lifnehem, I'm reading that as, and you'll be answerable to them.
That's interesting. I think in the Midrash it gets pretty literalistic. The question is, what does it mean, Yavo Lifnehem, in the Midrash? I think it means to return. And the Midrash is optimistic. You'll go out to battle and you'll return. Because the Midrash here is being pretty literalistic. In other places, the Midrash could get more, figurative. Okay, maybe the last, I said 3, but the last question or comment, and then I'll stick around. Yes.
You could comment perhaps on the dichotomy throughout our history in certain periods of time. There was both a military leader and a spiritual leader that worked hand in hand. For example, Bar Kokhba and Rabbi Akiva was the spiritual inspiration, and there was also a military leader. Could you comment on that?
The question is there a military leader and a spiritual leader? I think, as a generalization, that might be true at some points. I don't know if there's necessarily one clear leader. In the rebellion against Rome, at least from the later rabbinic legends that we have it, the rabbis are pretty, they're sort of with Josephus and being pretty against the rebellion. So they're not standing up there with the rebel leaders. During Bar Kokhba's time, it seems that some rabbis are with him, probably more in support than actually battling. And then if you're asking me in a more panoramic macro sense, I think it depends. Certainly in the biblical accounts, we have some stories where we think of the leader as being the leader of both. And the rabbis, interestingly, here are painting Moshe that way, that they're saying Moshe is not just Rabbeinu, just the teacher and the spiritual leader, but also they see him here as being literally involved. By the way, interesting, what about in the battle against Amalek? We have a little of a different account there, but that's in the Bible. And, if you think of David, and we do think of him as a warrior, and is he a spiritual leader? We usually think of him that way. So I think in the Bible, I don't know. We'd have to go through each period as my comment. It's a point well taken, but I think it depends. Some periods it's one way, some another way. But it's good when we could have enough of, political and spiritual leaders who are enough on the same page. We're only in our times. Okay, good evening. We'll daven, and for those who want. Exactly, Rav Goren and Ravin. I like it. Okay. Thanks, everyone.